So what makes you tick? I mean, really tick. For more than a century, psychology has been on this huge mission to answer that very question, basically creating different maps of the human mind. In this explainer, we're going to go on a whirlwind tour of the biggest ideas that have tried to explain what makes you, well, you.
All right, let's start with the big one. Who's really in the driver's seat of your life? Is it the world around you, kind of shaping your every move? Or is it your own internal monologue, the way you think about things? Or maybe, just maybe, it's something deeper, an innate push to become the best version of yourself. Each of these answers represents a major school of thought we're about to dive into.
Okay, so our journey kicks off back in the early 20th century. A bunch of scientists got together and basically said, hey, if we can't see it and we can't measure it, we're not going to study it. Now, that was a pretty radical idea, and it put human behavior, and only behavior, right under the microscope.
And this new school of thought was called behaviorism. Think of guys like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. They argued that the human mind was, for all intents and purposes, a black box. We can see the stuff that goes in, the stimulus, and we can see the behavior that comes out, the response. But everything in between, thoughts, feelings, all that messy stuff, they said that's off limits for real science.
Now, the first big tool in their toolkit was something called classical conditioning. And what's wild is that you've almost definitely experienced this, even if you didn't know the name. You ever hear a specific song and it just instantly throws you back to your first crush and all those feelings come rushing back? Yep, that's classical conditioning. A totally neutral thing, the song, gets powerfully linked to an emotional response.
Of course, the most famous example comes from the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. It basically broke down like this. At first, a dog drools over food, obviously, but couldn't care less about a bell. Then Pavlov starts ringing a bell right before he brought out the food. He did this over and over. And you know what happened? After a while, just the sound of the bell itself was enough to make the dog start salivating. A brand new behavior was learned, just by pairing two things together.
And let me tell you, the behaviorists were incredibly confident about this. This quote from John B. Watson just shows you how ambitious they were. He truly believed that if you gave him the right environment, he could shape any baby into anything, a doctor, a lawyer, you name it, and it didn't matter who their parents were. For these guys, nurture wasn't just part of the story, it was the entire story.
Okay, but classical conditioning really only explains those automatic reflex-like responses. What about all the new things we choose to do, like deciding to clean your room or learning to ride a bike? Well, that's where B.F. Skinner steps in. He came up with operant conditioning, which is the idea that our behavior is shaped by what happens after we do it, by the consequences, the rewards, and the punishments.
So here's the key difference. It's all about the timing. As you can see here, classical conditioning is all about associating a stimulus that happens before a behavior. Think of Pavlov's bell ringing before the food. But operant conditioning? That's all about the consequence that comes after the behavior. So if a dolphin does a cool flip and gets a fish, you can bet it's going to do that flip again. The behavior is controlled by the outcome.
So, for decades, behaviorism was king. But, eventually a new generation of psychologists started to wonder, what if that black box of the mind, what if that was actually the most important part of the whole puzzle? And this was the start of the cognitive revolution.
A huge figure in this big shift was Jean Piaget. He spent his time studying how children think and reason, and he argued that there's no way we could possibly understand how people develop without looking at our internal mental processes. For him, how we build our understanding of the world was, well, it was everything.
And Piaget's central idea was the schema. The easiest way to think about a schema is like a mental container, or maybe a blueprint. We have schemas for literally everything. What a dog is, how you're supposed to act in a fancy restaurant, what a birthday party is like. They're basically the mental shortcuts we use to make sense of a really complicated world.
So what happens when we see something new? Well, the first thing we try to do is what's called assimilation. We try to cram that new experience into a container we already have. So a toddler who has a schema for doggy, 4 legs, furry, has a tail, might see a cat for the very first time and shout, "Doggy." They're just assimilating that cat into their existing dog schema. Makes sense, right?
But then, assimilation doesn't always work. Someone corrects the kid and says, "No, sweetie, that's a cat." Now they have to do something called accommodation. They have to adjust their understanding. Maybe they create a whole new cat schema, or they tweak their doggy schema to be a little more specific. And this little two-step dance of assimilation and accommodation, according to Piaget, that is the engine of learning.
So, based on this whole process, Piaget said that our ability to think develops in 4 distinct stages. We go from being tiny infants learning that things still exist even when we can't see them, all the way to being teenagers who can think about abstract ideas. Each stage represents a massive change in how we think and reason about the world around us.
So now we have the behaviorists, who are totally focused on the outside world, and the cognitivists, who are focused on our inner thoughts. But then, a third group came along and basically said that both of them were missing something absolutely vital: the uniquely human drive to grow, to get better, and to find meaning in our lives.
This was the humanistic school of thought. Humanists, with leaders like Abraham Maslow, really offered a much more optimistic take on human nature. They believed we aren't just puppets controlled by our environment, and we're not just cogs in some mental machine. No, they said we are motivated by a deep desire to reach our fullest potential, a process he called self-actualization.
And Maslow organized all of these motivations into his super famous hierarchy of needs. The idea is actually pretty simple, but it's powerful. We have to satisfy our most basic, fundamental needs at the bottom of the pyramid before we can even start to think about the higher-level stuff at the top. I mean, you can't really worry about achieving your life's purpose if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, right?
Maslow also made a really key distinction here. He called the bottom 4 levels deficiency needs. Basically, you're motivated because you feel like you're lacking something. You're hungry, you feel unsafe, you're lonely. But that top level, self-actualization, that's a growth need. Here, the motivation isn't about filling some void. It's about a positive desire to just grow and become more.
Maslow's pyramid became one of the most famous ideas in all of psychology, and it feels so intuitive, doesn't it? But as research has gone on, some really important questions have come up about whether this neat and tidy pyramid really applies to everyone, everywhere, in the same way.
For starters, researchers have found that in a lot of collectivist cultures, the needs of the community might actually be seen as more fundamental than individual needs like self-esteem. There are also claims that Maslow's pyramid was heavily influenced by the philosophy of the Blackfoot Nation, but that it didn't fully capture their more circular, holistic worldview. And finally, life just shows us that the order isn't always so rigid. People find meaning and pursue huge goals even when they're facing incredible hardship.
So, we've got 3 very different maps of the mind. One focused on behavior, one on thought, and one on our drive to grow. So, who's right? Well, the modern view in psychology says that's actually the wrong question to be asking.
The big takeaway for today is this idea of theoretical complementarity. It sounds complicated, but it just means that these theories aren't fighting each other. They're more like different lenses, and each one offers a valuable but incomplete view. To really understand a person, you have to see how their environment has shaped their behavior, how their own thoughts interpret their world, and what inner needs are pushing them forward. They all work together.
And that really just leaves us with one final thought. We've looked at behaviorism, cognitivism, and humanism. Each one tells a different story about who we are. So as you think about your own life, your habits, your thoughts, your biggest goals, which one of these maps feels most true to you?